Good afternoon. It is great to see that you are back after lunch. It's the risky timing for a panel. And welcome for a wonderful panel which will deal with the military regime in Argentina, not exactly with the same years, but yes, with the same regime. And we are short of time, so I will be very brief. The first speaker is David Sheinin from Trent University, who is actually a visiting professor here at Tel Aviv University. And the title of his presentation is Military Rule and the Structuring of Jewish Identity in Argentina, 1976-1983. Please, David, 22 minutes. That's the agreement between us.
From when I begin.
Because I'm very strict.
Thank you, Claudia. Good afternoon, everybody. Most of them are not here, but I'd like to thank Omri, Chagai, Ezekiel, and Mayan for the work that they have done on the conference and otherwise. Last night, my meal came a little bit late at dinner, and Mayan literally offered me food off her plate. That's the level of commitment and energy I've come to expect of the Abraham Center, and I'm very happy for my association with these people. I want to say hello to my student Yasser Ibrahim, who is watching from Ghana. So I've done my part for the virtual audience. We're now at 801. The March 1976 coup d'etat in Argentina ushered in 7 years of military rule. Within weeks of the takeover, the emerging international human rights community shifted focus to that country. That not only shaped international human rights law for decades, but prompted an ongoing secret and sometimes frenzied Argentine government response. One key element of what Argentine military authorities perceived as an international human rights menace to the country's place in the international community was the characterization of the dictatorship as Nazi and anti-Semitic. Much has been written about anti-Semitism and the Argentine dictatorship. Anti-Jewish prejudice was present within the Argentine armed forces and in right-wing political circles long before 1976. At the same time, analyses of dictatorship anti-Semitism have often stopped there. The explanation for how the military understood and therefore treated Jewish Argentines was forged years, if not decades, before 1976. The most famous victim of military terror, Jacobo Timerman, began to advance that narrative in the late 1970s, and scholars have rarely questioned it. Nor has what some call the collective memory of dictatorship challenged the linearity of that outline. As far as Jews were concerned, the military came to power in March 1976, loaded for bear, with decades of ideological, cultural, and tactical anti-Semitic baggage. Yet, just as the experience of Jewish Argentines under dictatorship was nuanced and in no way uniform, so too was the military approach to Jewish Argentines and the construction of a Jewish enemy. Just as we still know little, for example, of Peronist and anti-Peronist factions of military officers who participated in the annihilation operations against their internal enemies before and after 1976, so too is there little work on a documentary or oral history of how the Argentine military developed its ideas on a Jewish menace after 1976. I'm going to focus on one specific case whose chronological fulcrum comes in 1981. I'd like to show how an Argentine dictatorship Jewish identity, already forged by the Jacobo Timerman case, and a broader resonance of the association in the international community of the Argentine dictatorship with Nazism, shaped diplomacy, politics, and legal action, and how, in turn, this case reinforced those same identity markers. The case neither subtracts from nor adds to what we know of the force of dictatorship anti-Semitism. It shows, rather, how different constituencies advance their positions in that context, and it is representative of many other cases. The night of the 1976 coup d'etat, masked men broke into José Siderman's home in Tucumán. The story ends more than 30 years later when the Argentine government settled a Siderman family claim in U.S. court stemming from the illicit kidnapping and torture of José and the confiscation of family assets. Argentina paid the family $6 million in a non-disclosure settlement. In 1975, the armed forces had divided the country into 4 military zones with new policing and security powers. The new dictatorship named General Antonio Domingo Bussi governor of Tucumán with oversight of that province as one of the zones. In many respects, Bussi ran the province as a fiefdom. On the night of the coup, 10 masked men burst into Siderman's home. They removed him, threw him onto the floor of a car where on the trip to a clandestine detention center, he was repeatedly kicked and threatened with death. His captors tortured him for 7 days with an electric prod and in other ways while calling out Jew bastard and shitty Jew. Siderman owned Inmobiliaria del Noroeste, Inosa, which was in the process of building the largest hotel in the north of Argentina, the Hotel Gran Corona in the city of Tucumán. In an odd twist, his illicit detention in 1976 was not his first. In 1974, the Montonero guerrilla group had kidnapped Siderman and had held him for 3 weeks until a substantial ransom was paid. I can only speculate on this next point. We know that many in the armed forces had made an anti-Semitic leap in tying the banker David Greiver to financing the Montoneros. It's possible that Bussi was suspicious of the Montonero kidnapping story. He likely knew of a previous bizarre incident in which the Bonaerense, the Buenos Aires provincial police, had arrived at Greiver's father's house. Juan Greiver mistook them on that occasion for Montoneros, at which point he's betrayed his friendly ties to that group. Siderman was almost certainly among many Argentines targeted in advance of the coup for illegal property seizure. Because the earlier Montonero kidnapping and Siderman's ransom payment had been publicized, Bussi or those around him knew he had important assets. In addition to his having been snatched from his home the same day as the coup d'etat, no sooner had the coup been declared than the well-off residential sector of the city where Siderman lived was declared an emergency zone and the streets cleared of non-military personnel. Though blindfolded during his kidnapping, Siderman heard his masked captors issuing and responding to military orders. During his internment, Siderman's torturers told him he'd best get out of the country. At some point after his release, Siderman fled. In 1981, the military government issued an ex post facto extradition order in response to a federal court determination that Siderman had committed fraud. Bussi and his allies in Tucumán set in motion a scheme to win control of Siderman's property. They falsified provincial property registries to show Siderman's ownership of only 127 of the 127,000 acres he held in the province. They altered public records to take control of Inosa while imprisoning, then assassinating the accountant that Siderman had left in charge of the operation. In 1982, the Siderman family filed that complaint I mentioned in U.S. court, asserting 18 causes of action for torture, harassment, and the illicit expropriation of property. And as I said, it was not until 1996 that Siderman's family won the out-of-court settlement from the Argentine government. Okay, what makes this case Jewish? I take as a given the argument that many military officers came to power in 1976 with decades of anti-Semitic ideas in hand, but also that Jewish Argentines did not all self-identify as opponents of military rule in 1976. That starts with both Jacobo Timerman and his son Hector, the latter of whom defended the coup in the newspaper he edited at the time, La Tarde. It's in this context that I'd like to consider the Siderman case as a way to understand how the principles concerned built Jewish identities and for the military enmities. That Siderman was kidnapped both by the left-wing Montoneros and by military officers, and for the same reason, is an anomaly. But it underlines that Siderman may not have been targeted as a Jew. On that first night of the coup d'etat, when Siderman was picked up, 300 other Tucumanos were detained, a majority for cash shakedowns. A small minority were Jews. That this case of kidnapping and extortion became a problem for the dictatorship and for two democratic governments that followed, while others did not, has to do with a variety of factors that include the ingenuity of Siderman and his family in leaving Argentina and mounting a case in the United States, but also the transformation of the issue into a Jewish problem by Siderman, by his allies in the United States who had other agendas, and by the military government itself. At least as early as 1979, the Sidermans were aware of the power of the international human rights community on the dictatorship and moved effectively to cast their plight as primarily a question of anti-Semitism. The first testimony of anti-Semitic insults, such as those I mentioned, on the night of the kidnapping came in the US court. More important, the family marshaled powerful allies in the United States on the issue of discrimination. In 1981, the Argentine government won an Interpol detention order against Siderman in Italy, where he was at the time. Morton Rosenthal, director of B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, immediately contacted the Argentine embassy in Washington. Rosenthal had had a complex relationship with the embassy and with the military government. On the one hand, he sympathized in writing with the dictatorship for terrorist attacks by the Argentine revolutionary left against members of the military. At the same time, he would have none of Argentine government denials that anti-Semitism was a problem in Argentina. In 1978, he criticized the Argentine ambassador in Washington, Jorge Aja Espil, on the latter's assertion that anti-Semitism was not a serious problem. Quote, "A crucial question is not whether it exists, but government policy toward it. Much of the criticism directed against your country on anti-Semitism is due to the perception that the Argentine government has failed to take timely and effective action to halt or prevent it." For Rosenthal to weigh in on Siderman rendered the problem much larger for the military government than had been the case, than the case simply of a wronged Tucumán businessman, Jewish or otherwise. Rosenthal had been in touch with the Argentine government earlier when Siderman had been tried and convicted of fraud and had already accused Argentine authorities of anti-Semitic persecution. Moreover, on news of the Interpol detention, Siderman's son, Carlos, now a resident of California and a US citizen, had contacted the US Embassy in Buenos Aires, which in turn had begun to lobby the Argentine government in May 1981 over the issue of anti-Semitism. Also in May, US pressure intensified. The former US ambassador to Argentina, Raúl Castro, appeared at the Argentine embassy in Washington with Carlos Siderman. Castro pointed out that he had asked the US State Department to take up Jose Siderman's extradition case through the US consulate in Milan. Carlos Siderman underlined that the Siderman's case was, quote, diametrically opposed to that of Timerman, end quote. His goal, he said, was for this case to have no publicity. The threat was explicit. This isn't Timerman, but it could be. Castro went on to underline his own ties to the Jewish community in California and urged a quick solution to the case. The strategy worked. The Argentine embassy alerted the foreign ministry that this case risked having Timerman-like repercussions in US Congress and in the international media. A day later, the Argentine consulate in Milan also alerted the Argentine foreign ministry that the US government had taken an interest in the case, quote, by way of an American legislator representing the Jewish lobby, unquote. I expect, the consul general went on, the incident is susceptible to political exploitation. That same day, the foreign ministry responded to a request from the US embassy for information on the judicial proceedings against Siderman. At that point, the executive branch had no sense of the Timerman-like potential of the case, or that the case even existed. First, the Interior Minister privately reported to the Foreign Minister that he knew nothing of the case. That's private correspondence. This was significant in that the Interior Ministry in Argentina not only had become aware of the Timerman case while Jacobo Timerman was in detention, but had managed the international fallout from the case through his judicial exile from Argentina, a clear example of the intersection of judiciary and executive branch powers in that earlier case. Second, The Sederman extradition request through Interpol, the foreign ministry maintained privately, responded to a federal court order. The Justice Ministry had been contacted with an immediate request for information. It's worth reflecting briefly on the distinction the executive branch was making here. In private documentation, the executive branch was recognizing what it denied publicly. Judicial decisions were influenced by the dictatorship. At the same time, in a bit of a panic, the executive branch was now scrambling over the Sederman case, of which it had no earlier knowledge. The points were plausible. Judicial decisions between 1976 and 83 were not always flawed and not always influenced by military intervention, if only because the government was not sufficiently efficient to maintain that ongoing reach. 10 days later, the foreign ministry pushed back. After Raul Castro had flown to Buenos Aires now to lobby Argentine authorities directly, the foreign ministry asked the Argentine embassy in Washington to make clear to the U.S. Department of State that the extradition request through Interpol was a judicial matter and, as such, untouchable by executive authorities. The foreign ministry wanted the U.S. government to know that while what it called, quote, certain activist currents, unquote, wished to suggest otherwise, the extradition request had no political motive. On June 22nd, the Argentine consul in Milan, Diego Medus, wrote angrily about developments. Sederman had been granted house arrest in Italy. Moreover, Medus had been lobbied by the U.S. consul, who informed him of a meeting that had taken place between de facto Argentine President Roberto Viola and former Ambassador Castro, whom Medus called, quote, the cannon, unquote, in his telegram, a snide reference to Castro's supposedly bullish American qualities. This has now gone up to Viola. The U.S. consul claimed that not only had Viola promised to look into the Sederman case, but had in addition offered to rescind the extradition request. Jose Sederman had also called by phone, mentioning the Viola-Castro meeting and asking for consideration in light of his having spent his 70th birthday behind bars in Italy. There had been a third call from Castro. Naturally, Medus complained the call was not returned. An Italian court turned down the extradition. It's not clear whether that decision came in part as a result of the Argentine government's intervention in keeping with Castro's account of his meeting with Viola. Whatever the case, on his return to California, where he now resided, Jose Sederman turned up the volume, telling the media that he left Argentina in 1976 on having received death threats simply, he stated, because he was an Argentine Jew. It's impossible to say whether Sederman's Jewish identity diplomacy played a role in the extradition failure. Sederman immediately ensconced himself in California, where his family embarked on a 15-year legal battle with the Argentine government, initially asking a U.S. court for $1 billion in damages. The democratically elected governments of Raúl Alfonsín and Carlos Menem both fought that action, drawing in significant measure on the late 1970s Argentine judicial case for fraud. That is, both the Alfonsín and Menem governments treated the Argentine judiciary as independent of military rule in this case and respected that finding of fraud. When the government finally settled with the Sederman family for $6 million, it was partly a matter of expense. Their lead counsel, Bruno Ristau, pointed out that Argentina had already spent $700,000 on the case. This is long before it got to court, would likely have to shell out an additional $200,000 to get the case to trial. The government was looking at millions in costs, even if they won. Why didn't the Alfonsín government simply settle with the Sedermans? Federal legislation passed in 1984 nullified dictatorship-era civilian court decisions on the assumption that the courts had not been able to function freely. Despite this, on Sederman, the Argentine government cited dictatorship-era decisions by the First Federal Court of Tucumán, rejecting claims for damages made by the Sedermans. Moreover, the Alfonsín administration rejected the arguments made by the Sedermans and by human rights groups that General Bussi had conspired to seize Sederman's property. It's possible that the Alfonsín and Menem administrations simply didn't want to pay. Alternatively, is it possible that the Tucumán Federal Court during the dictatorship was right in its conviction of Siderman for fraud. Is that the story? Siderman claimed that authorities in Tucumán had seized his properties illicitly by falsifying registries and by killing the accountant. The Tucumán court maintained that the Siderman family had sold its holdings to Miguel Naef Mejail. No property had been seized by Bussi or anybody else. This was the position of both Alfonsín and Menem. Part of the reason Argentina dropped the California case in 1996 was that Naef Mejail's daughter, Sonia Mejail, the owner of what had once been Siderman's hotel, now refused to testify in California until Argentine authorities paid her a settlement she had reached with the Argentine government for her family's loss of property to military seizure during the dictatorship. There's more. José Siderman's police records show that at ages 24, 32, 34, and 42, he had been convicted of fraud all on separate occasions. Then at 44, he was convicted a fifth time, now of defrauding the Banco de la Provincia de Tucumán. That doesn't make him guilty in 1976 when he was 65, but it sure raises some questions. Siderman's atypical. Even the cases that gained some international exposure and foreign requests for information on the detained rarely led to an escape of this sort and a happy landing in the United States, rarely led to the personal intervention of figures as important as Castro or Rosenthal or Viola, or the potential for the alteration of a court finding or jail sentence for the thousands in the Poder Ejecutivo Nacional during the proceso. The evidence suggests that each of the actors in this case drew on a constructed Jewish identity under a Nazi-like dictatorship to advance their interests. Would the Sidermans have landed successfully in California otherwise? It seems doubtful. In 1981, the Argentine government was also likely motivated by one more factor, a rapid thaw in relations with the United States in 1980. There was a flurry of high-level friendly U.S. visits to Argentina that year. This is still the Carter administration, including those of General Andrew Goodpaster, former commander-in-chief of the U.S. European Command, Ambassador Gerald Smith, a non-proliferation expert, and Secretary of the Navy Edward Hidalgo. The Argentine Foreign Minister, Carlos Washington Pastor, met with U.S. Secretary of State Edwin Muskie at the United Nations in New York at that time, and in a remarkable about-face late in the Carter administration, Muskie made clear that the United States no longer held Argentina responsible for the so-called 1980 cocaine coup in Bolivia, and with Washington Pastor present, instructed his subordinates to oppose a United Nations resolution critical of Argentina's human rights record. That's all under Carter still. The Argentine government is very aware of this. More important, Argentine officials were well aware of early 1981 Reagan administration policy positions accusing the Carter administration of having held hostage countries traditionally friendly toward the United States with regard to human rights. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig and UN Permanent Representative Jeane Kirkpatrick had introduced a distinction between human rights abusers and regimes that, like Argentina, in their view, might occasionally take what they called necessary actions that set aside human rights. Things look good in relations with the United States. It seems unlikely that the thaw in relations would not have influenced how each of the parties in the Siderman case acted in 1981. One more point to finish. The Siderman family took that $6 million, which suggests that they had plenty more, and they gave it to the University of Southern California to found a human rights chair. Whatever the truth is, blanquearon la otra historia de fraude, etc. So in the end, this turns into a very successful story, whatever happened or didn't happen. Thank you.